Sure. Um, Another filler video here, and this is about a very specific topic that I've been meaning to talk about for quite a while, actually. But I think this is a very simple thing to explain. You see, in our culture, we usually expect the nuclear family, you know, the husband and the wife that takes care of the kids, and so that's the nuclear family that we're used to. And I put the husband at the center because the husband, or whoever the breadwinner is at the center and does do most of the control at the house, while the wife or feminine figure or supporting figure in the house supports the husband, but the husband primarily is in control. And we see this as traditional, as natural almost, but it's very specific to particularly Western and Christian culture. So I'm gonna draw a cross here, and I know I'm just gonna draw west. However, it's worth realizing that this shouldn't, or usually isn't the default. Usually that there is some sort of extended family or camp of people, or at least in a state of nature. So for example, the Hadza has 20 people. I'm like 20 to, I think, 30 people in a given camp. So just depict it here. And generally it's non-hierarchical, meaning that there's very little stratification. So there, of course, there is parent, offspring, or guardian child relationships, right? But generally, it is very egalitarian. The Huts are, in effect, anarchist, right? So, because, or at least we would call them anarchist. I don't want to misrepresent the culture here because I'm not a Hadza person. So, but there is very little stratification, and instead of the normal power structure like bosses, politicians, there is instead consensus, a consensus made akin to voting, kind of. In my opinion, what's ideal is to emulate a state of nature as much as possible, which I believe is best done through the extended family, which a lot of other cultures do. And this is very prevalent before Christianity, but nonetheless, it's more natural. So I imagine it would come in one of two forms. Either you would have a very multi-generational household with the grandparents, parents, and children. This is a very minimalistic example, by the way. And in my opinion, it would be very minimalistic, but that is partially just me. And then there's also the possibility of very polygamous families. So let's say there are two men and two adult women, and there are, say, 5 children, because that's very easy in this type of household. This this is more efficient, as I'd like to organize this based on level of collectivism. So you're generally trying to put a circle around this. Sorry, it moved. I actually put this little thing here, this a multi-use knife thing. I think it's called a pocket knife, but I feel uncertain about that. But anyway, I'm using this to keep this in place, but I see that it's become unsuccessful. But anyway, generally, this is the most individualist, this is in the middle, and this is most collectivist. Actually, I think collectivist is the wrong choice of words, but the arrow points to a bigger... That's poorly written. Sorry. Bigger and more socialistic families. And I'm saying socialistic because I'm very abstract. I feel like using the term socialist, but I'm being very abstract here. Basically, there's a bigger family, and the family is more cooperative, generally, at least. Now, personally, I don't like this. At the very least, I think this should be thought of as or atomizing relative to the extended family. I think this or this should be considered the default, because this is unnatural, and I think it leads to a lot of abuse, because there is more opportunity for stratification, more opportunity because there are less people watching you, less worrying about what other people think of you. And this, I admit, the nuclear family does have its merits, but what I prefer less is the single parent family. So parent and children. And you can, not to say that this is toxic necessarily, it doesn't have to be toxic at least, but it leads to more atomization than there should be. And unless you have like friends, it just seems very lonely. Unless you have a lot of friends, it seems relatively lonely. But the absolute worst thing is not having a family at all, and you're raised by, like, I don't know, robots. And you're raised by robots, and I think of robots because this is kind of what ABA is trying to push on children. Because if you think about it, ABA isn't really social, it's just one person applying operant conditioning on children. Bender would actually be a bad example because, well, he would be a very bad parent. Actually, now that I think about it, he probably would be neglectful, but when I talk about being raised by a robot, I mean like a robot that would do ABA, like ABA instructors, but automated. It's a little ironic that I put it on the left, because this is what the capitalists would push for. So, but what the leftists would push for is eusocialism, and a thing that I think I made up, but it might have already existed, which I call transegoism. So Um, this is a general illustration of what's going on. So take this a little abstractly, not too literally, but anyway, after this is the natural system of humanity, and or at least probably the most natural system. But there is also eusocialism, or actually, I want to draw it here because I have a little more space here, and I feel like it's gonna need a lot of space, and that's because eusocialism, or eusociality as most people would call it, is basically a society that has the maximal amount of cooperation. This is associated with, actually, this is something that describes bees, but don't think of it as hyper collectivist. Think of it as a specific system that's highly cooperative. So, to be specific, there would be cooperative brood care, and there will be extreme division of labor, especially in reproduction. So there are some who can reproduce. Let's draw this, and there are those who can't, which and these are usually workers or warriors, stuff like that. There would also be overlapping generations, so overlapping generation, which basically means that within a point of time, there are multiple generations which can reproduce, which, if you think about it, is already kind of true in humans, but usually there is only one generation that can reproduce in a given species. Now, this probably isn't possible for another, say, 10,000 years. It's going to be thousands and thousands of years, at the very least, until this is possible for humans. And don't think of it like how a bee colony would work, because human eusociality would be way more complex than what the bees do. But in my opinion, I believe the LGBT community is most capable of this, because the LGBT mentality isn't designed immediately for reproduction. So this is not to say that homosexual couples can reproduce, but first of all, they can't reproduce with each other, at least not with today's technology, or certainly not with today's technology, and certainly not naturally. They have to rely on a surrogate mother or father to reproduce. But I do think it's clear that, well, they can reproduce, that they mean that sexuality has a purpose, or has been given a purpose, beyond reproduction. And this may have already happened with another species, but we at the very least know that this is going on in humans, because otherwise they would just be out of the gene pool because of natural selection. So instead, it's social. I know I wrote LGBT, but I don't think that being transgender is as useful in a eusocial society. But I imagine that it could be more related to instead transegoism. Now, I would say transegoism is very similar to eusociality in that the family is so extended that, in a sense, the entire society is a friend or family member, or in a sense, because there is such high cooperation. But I imagine transegoism as more individualistic. Essentially, you have each person within this system, and they have their internal mind, but they also have their external minds, like their to-do list, you know, and other people. And basically, the goal of transegoism is to combine all of them into one mind. And it basically means that each brain is collectivized, but not minds. There's a very big distinction there, because this is all one mind, because while it utilizes the entire space, it still accumulates into an individual. However, this wouldn't be an individual in the traditional sense, because first of all, it's very transient, because you're basically relying on other people to complete your mind. And what essentially happens is that the external mind is just as important as the internal mind in making decisions. So basically, you're collectivizing the ego, but you still have the mind. You still have the self, just not the ego. Often people would make choices for you, but you would also make choices for them. So it's not like one-sided or anything like that. Now, as an autistic person, I think that transegoism is better than eusocialism, or is more evolved than eusocialism, which I say autistic because I believe that autistic people are closer to the system, or at least closest to this system, as opposed to neurotypicals. And honestly, neurodiversity also probably plays a part in a eusocial system, because, there is very high specialization. But I think it is particularly autistic people that would be best at making a trans-egoist society, because I think the autistic mind is so well focused that it can make a system like eusocialism, but autistic people are too individualistic. So instead, what would happen is transegoism, where there is still uh, hyper specialization, but it's more transient. Like there aren't hard casts. It's more like you would be able to become different people, and if we're being very futuristic, have a different body altogether. Now, transegoism is probably even more far off than the eusocialism, but that's everything that's uh, more what I would say advanced. And I say advanced because I am biased saying that, but something anything more advanced represents an ideal to strive towards. And I figure that most people would most certainly not agree with eusociality or transegoism, but at the very least realize that this isn't the natural system. Again, it has its merits, but it's not the natural system.